She built an empire from the ashes of a war no woman was supposed to survive. She bled beside him, starved beside him, buried soldiers beside him when the ground was frozen and the sky offered nothing. And tonight, in the hall, she helped raise stone by stone. Her husband seated a palace maid on his throne and made his Luna stand below the nobles like she was nobody. Like she was nothing. If you've ever loved someone so completely that their betrayal doesn't feel like a wound, it feels like an erasure. Stay with me until the end. Drop your city name in the comments. Hit that like. Because this story doesn't end where you think it does. Quote, the banquet hall of Velmora's iron citadel had been dressed for the moon ascension, with the kind of brutal grandeur that only empires built on conquest could produce. Iron chandeliers carrying 500 candles hung from vaulted ceilings, carved with the faces of dead kings. Black wolf banners fell 60 feet from the rafters, their silver thread catching the candlelight like scales on moving water. The long feasting tables were set with obsidian plates and goblets hammered from silver, taken off the necks of surrendered lords. Everything in that hall had a history of violence behind it. Everything had cost someone something irreplaceable. Luna Celine Veilor had helped choose every one of those banners. She stood in the antechamber doorway, her reflection caught for 1/2 second in the polished iron wall panel before a servant pulled the door open and the heat and noise of 200 wolves swallowed her whole. She was wearing the deep charcoal gown she'd had made for this occasion, the one that matched the color of Velmora's winter sky at the hour before dawn. Not purely black, not quite gray, a color that existed between states. Her dark hair was pinned with a single iron clasp shaped like a crescent moon. No jewels. Celine had worn jewels twice in her life, and both times they'd felt like decorative chains. She was 29 years old, and she had not looked her age since she was 22, when the weight of the throne had settled behind her eyes and stopped leaving. The court announced her entrance with the traditional cry, Luna Celine, bloodbound mate of Alpha King Draven Viremont, moons chosen of Velmora. And the hall rippled with the practiced deference of wolves who knew which direction power faced. Heads tilted, conversations paused. The lesser nobles bowed from the waist, some with genuine respect, many with the performance of it. She walked through the parted crowd with her chin level and her stride unhurried. She had learned to walk this way during the second year of Draven's wars, when the supply lines were cut and her own generals were looking at her sideways, measuring whether the Luna would break. She had not broken then. She had walked through that camp the same way she walked through everything. Like the ground owed her nothing, and she expected nothing from it. She found Draven's gaze across the hall before she found his body. He was already watching her. He was always watching her. That was the thing people outside their marriage never understood. Even when he was destroying her, he watched. His eyes were the color of a storm-darkened sea, pale gray with shifting darkness underneath, and they were locked on her face with an intensity that some women in this court had openly envied. Some still did, not knowing what that intensity had cost Celine over the past 4 months. He was standing at the head of the hall beside the raised dais where the royal table sat. He was wearing his formal blacks, the ones with the high collar and the Viremont wolf crest embossed in gray across the chest. He was 33, and he looked like what he was, a man who had been fighting since he was old enough to hold weight in his hands, and who had never once in his life been made to feel small. Broad through the shoulders, a jaw that looked carved rather than grown, the kind of face that didn't ask for anything from a room but got it anyway. Standing one step below him, at his right hand where Celine always stood, was Lyra. Celine's feet continued moving. She would think about this moment later, alone, and she would be furious with herself for the fraction of a second her body had hesitated, not stopped, not stumbled, just that nearly imperceptible catch that no one in the room could have seen except possibly Draven, who saw everything. Her feet continued moving. Her face held. Lyra was 19. A palace maid who had arrived 18 months ago from one of the eastern provinces, the daughter of a minor household that served the citadel. She was small, fair-haired, with the kind of gentle prettiness that made older women feel both protective and uneasy. She had done nothing Celine could point to as deliberate. She had never been aggressive or grasping or cruel. She had simply been there, in the places where Celine was increasingly absent, and Draven had begun paying her the kind of quiet attention that in a lesser court might have gone unnoticed. In Velmora's court, nothing went unnoticed, Lyra was wearing a silver gown. The court's ceremonial color for the Moon Ascension banquet was iron gray, and silver was reserved for royal blood. Selene wore charcoal precisely because she understood the hierarchy of these signals. Lyra was wearing a silver gown, and she was standing at Draven's right hand, and she had a goblet that one of the king's personal servants had placed there for her. Her eyes were cast down toward the floor. She was not performing triumph. If anything, she looked frightened, which Selene might have taken as evidence of innocence if she'd had any capacity left for that kind of mercy. Draven watched Selene walk the full length of the hall toward the dais, and he did not move to meet her. He did not extend his hand. He did not descend the 2 steps to stand beside her the way he had done at every formal entrance for 7 years of marriage. He simply watched, with that precise and terrible attention, and waited. Alpha King. She said it at the edge of the dais, because if he was going to make her address him formally in front of 200 people, she would address him formally. Luna. His voice was flat, not cold. Draven's voice was never cold the way cruel men's voices were cold, with the smugness of someone who enjoyed the damage. His flatness was something else, something she had been trying to decode for months. It felt like a door that had been sealed from the inside. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. In a royal hall, 4 seconds is a very long time. Lady Harville has been asking about the eastern trade routes, Selene said. She kept her voice even and turned slightly to acknowledge the older noblewoman at the near table. Lady Harville gave her a look of complicated pity. I told her we'd address it after the seating arrangement has changed tonight, Draven said. Not loudly. He never needed volume. Lyra will sit at my right. You'll take the secondary table. The secondary table was below the dais. It was where visiting dignitaries of moderate rank sat, when they weren't important enough for the high table but too important to be placed among the general nobility. It was not, in any stretch of the protocol Selene had spent 7 years learning and enforcing, an appropriate seat for the Luna of Velmora. She heard the room change. Not loud. A court like this one never got loud. But the quality of the silence shifted, the way it did when wolves caught a scent that meant something important was happening nearby. Conversations didn't stop. They became very carefully constructed to appear continuous while actually attending to what was happening on the dais. 200 people were watching without appearing to watch. I see, Selene said. She turned and walked to the secondary table and sat down. It was the hardest thing she'd done since she'd held Draven's second-in-command while he died of a stomach wound in the 4th year of the Western Campaign, and she'd needed to keep her face calm so the troops didn't break. The mechanics of it were almost identical. Choose the action, commit to it completely, strip the emotion somewhere internal where it can't reach your face or your limbs until later. Later. Not now. She sat down. She put her hands in her lap. She looked at the food on the obsidian plate in front of her, and she did not see any of it. Lord Cassian, who was seated across from her, and who had fought beside Draven and Selene, both in the northern campaigns, looked at her for a long moment and then looked away. He was a careful man. He had survived this court for 12 years through careful. The roasted boar is excellent this season, he said finally. I'm sure it is, Selene said. He didn't say anything else. She didn't expect him to. The banquet began. The first hour was the hardest because it was the hour she had to use the most muscle to hold herself together. The food came in courses. The wine was poured in the good Velmora Black that she had personally selected from the southern cellars 3 months ago when things were different. And above her on the dais, Draven spoke to Lyra in the quiet murmurs he used to reserve for Selene. Not romantic murmurs. Not tender. Just the low private register of someone speaking to a person they considered worthy of their actual attention. While the court of 200 souls arranged itself around that signal, like iron filings around a magnet, everyone recalibrating their positioning based on where the power appeared to be moving. Lady Durin stopped by to greet Selene. She was Draven's aunt by marriage, a woman of 50 with a face like a hatchet, and a reputation for saying exactly what she thought to everyone except the king, to whom she said nothing at all. She looked at Selene with something that might have been respect, or might have been the detached appraisal one gives a structure that appears to still be standing in bad weather. You look well, Lady Durin said. I feel well, Selene said. Good. She paused. I remember your ascension ceremony. You broke a man's wrist during the strength-binding trial. I've always thought that said something about your character. It said something about his grip, Celine said. He was holding too tight. Lady Durin made a sound that was almost a laugh and moved on. Celine picked up her goblet and drank the black wine and watched the candle wax drip down the iron holder in front of her and thought about absolutely nothing at all, which was the technique she'd developed in the 3rd year of the Western War, when the distance between what needed to be done and what she felt about it was so wide that thinking about both simultaneously would have split her in half. She had always been good at compartmentalization. She had never enjoyed it. The second hour was worse in a different way because the adrenaline had metabolized and the plain, unadorned reality of the situation had fully settled. She was sitting below the dais at the secondary table while her husband conducted the Moon Ascension banquet with a palace maid at his right hand. 7 years. She had tracked supply lines through frozen mountain passes and negotiated with warlords who thought mercy was a character flaw and presided over the sentencing of men twice her size who believed Aluna's authority was decorative. She had done all of it. She had done it without flinching because flinching was how you showed the wolves of Velmora exactly where to put the blade. And she was sitting at the secondary table. The thought arrived without her permission. If he wanted to kill me, this would be the slower method. She dismissed it. Not because it felt wrong, but because she didn't have the resources to examine it right now. General Kyle Drenvar arrived late. He came through the side entrance at the second hour's midpoint, still carrying road dust on his traveling cloak, which meant he'd ridden hard from the northern front and hadn't stopped to change. He was tall in the way that Draven's particular kind of alpha wolf often produced. Not excessively, but the kind of height that read as structural, like something load-bearing. Dark-haired, with the weathered quality of someone who'd spent more time outside than in and hadn't been bothered by this. He had a scar that ran from his left jaw to just below his ear that she knew the story of because she'd been the one who'd cleaned that wound in the field, the night of the Thornwall battle, when the medics were overrun. He stopped just inside the door and read the room in approximately 3 seconds, which was what made him an excellent general. His eyes found Draven at the head of the dais with Lyra beside him, and then found Celine at the secondary table, and the journey between those two observations lasted less than a heartbeat and produced nothing visible on his face. He crossed to the secondary table and sat down beside her. General Drenvar. She kept her voice neutral. Luna. He poured himself wine from the decanter without waiting to be served. The northern campaign is stable. I left Bryn in command of the Frostwall position. She's solid. I'm glad to hear it. He looked at her sideways. Not the way the rest of the court looked at her. Measuring, calculating, searching for weakness they could use or distance they should take. He looked at her the way you looked at someone you'd been through bad weather with, direct and without performance. You're going to want to eat something, he said quietly. I'm not particularly hungry. You're going to want to eat something anyway. Don't give them the visible version. It was the right thing to say. It was exactly the right thing, and it annoyed her that it was, because it meant she'd been closer to the visible version than she'd thought. She picked up her fork. She ate the roasted boar, which was in fact excellent. Kyle didn't say anything else for a while. He ate with the focused efficiency of someone who'd gotten used to meals being interrupted, and he poured her wine when her goblet was empty without making it a gesture, and he mentioned twice that the northern road between the Frostwall garrison and the capital needed serious bridge work before winter. The Greyvile Bridge is barely holding, he said. 3 wagons of supply came through last month. It took the weight, but not comfortably. I've had that report on my desk for 2 months, Celine said. The infrastructure allocation is tied to Draven's military spending review. So it'll be winter before anything moves. Likely. Bryn says the locals are already compensating by going around through the Hollowvale route, which adds 4 hours. Which means the winter supply delivery to the Frostwall garrison will arrive late if we have a cold snap before the first moon, Celine said. I know, I've been running the numbers. She paused. I sent a formal request to the King's Council 2 weeks ago. Kale was quiet for a moment. Did you get a response? I got a response indicating that the matter would be reviewed in the next quarter's infrastructure session. He looked at his plate. He didn't say what both of them knew, that a request from the Luna, a year ago, would not have been routed to a quarterly review. Up on the dais, Draven said something that made Lyra duck her head with a small startled smile. The court registered it. Celine heard, felt, really, since this kind of thing was physical as much as auditory, the shift in the room's attention as the observers processed the image of their Alpha King producing that expression in a palace maid. The smile had been involuntary on Lyra's part, Celine could see that from 40 feet away, but involuntary didn't mean invisible. Did you come straight from the road? She asked Kael, because she needed to be talking about something. Stopped for 2 hours at the garrison outside the city. I had dispatches. Anything I should know about? He considered this. Broden of the Eastern Cliffs sent another formal petition about the Grey Peak mining rights, the fourth one this year. The answer is still no. I know. I told his envoy that. The envoy said Lord Broden would be exploring other avenues of address, meaning he'll try Draven directly. Meaning he'll try whoever seems like the functional authority right now, Kael said, and then stopped because that sentence had a shape to it that wasn't purely about Broden. Celine set her fork down. She picked up her wine. She looked at the candle in front of her and she said very quietly, "Do you know what the worst part is?" Kael waited. "It's not the embarrassment. I've been embarrassed before. I've stood in front of dying men and made decisions that I knew were going to cost us, and I've been second-guessed and contradicted and undermined from every direction. And embarrassment is survivable. It's not that." She turned the goblet slowly in her fingers. The candlelight moved in it. "It's that I don't understand why," she said. "I can't find the logic, and I have spent 4 months looking for it." Kyle looked at her directly. His jaw was tight. "Celine, you're going to tell me there's a reason. I don't know that there's a... Everyone keeps implying there's a reason," she said, still quiet, still controlled. "Lady Durin implies it. Counselor Marveth implies it. Half the court implies it. In that particular way that means they know something I don't or think they do. And I would like..." She stopped. "Reset. I need to understand, Kael. Because I cannot operate without information, and right now I am operating entirely blind." He was quiet for a long time. Too long. The quality of it told her something she didn't know how to interpret yet. "I don't have information to give you," he said finally. "Not that I'm holding back. I genuinely don't have it. But you think there's something." He met her eyes. "I think Draven is not a stupid man." "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It's not." The banquet moved into its third hour, which was the entertainment portion. Musicians from the southern provinces playing the old Wolfpack war songs that predated the Empire by 200 years, the ones that were meant to remind the assembled nobility of what they were and where they'd come from and why that history demanded certain behaviors from them. The songs were about endurance and collective survival and the costs of betrayal. Celine had always found them affecting. Tonight she found them grim. She excused herself near the midpoint of the third hour, when the court had loosened enough with wine that her departure would register, but not dominate. She walked through the hall the same way she'd entered. Steady, unhurried, her spine carrying the load so her face didn't have to. She felt eyes on her back the entire length of the room. She felt one pair more than the rest. She did not look up at the dais as she passed it. The corridor outside the banquet hall was cool and quiet and smelled of stone and torch smoke. She walked to the window alcove at the corridor's far end, the one that looked out over the inner courtyard and the training yards beyond, where the barracks lights were already out for the night. She stood there and put one hand against the cold stone of the window frame and breathed. The moon was full. The moon ascension. A night that was supposed to mean something about cycles completing and power renewing and the bond between a mated pair strengthening in the presence of the full moon's pull. She had learned everything about that ceremony when she was 22 and newly mated, and still half convinced that she was living inside someone else's story. The girl from the borderlands who'd gone to war and ended up with an empire. She breathed. The cold came in through the window and she stood in it and let it work on the flush that she hadn't allowed herself to show in the banquet hall. She heard footsteps. Not Kael's. Different weight distribution. She turned. Draven was standing in the corridor doorway. He hadn't brought anyone with him. No guard, no advisor, none of the machinery of kingship. Just himself, in his formal blacks, watching her with that contained and unreadable attention. She said nothing. She waited. He crossed the corridor toward her. She stayed at the window. He stopped 6 feet away, which was, she noticed with the part of her brain that cataloged everything, closer than he'd been to her voluntarily in 3 weeks. "You left early," he said. "I'm still within the banquet's required attendance window," she said. I checked. Something shifted in his expression, too fast to name. "I'm not criticizing. I know what criticism sounds like from you, Draven. That wasn't what I was responding to." He was quiet. The torchlight moved along the corridor wall behind him. The northern dispatches came in, she said, when the silence had gone on long enough that something needed to fill it. Kale says the Greyvale Bridge needs. I'm not here to talk about the bridge. Then what are you here to talk about? He looked at her. That direct and complicated thing that had been the foundation of everything between them for 9 years. They'd met 2 years before the mating, and she had not trusted it even then, even when it was undeniably real, because she'd grown up in the kind of place that taught you real things could still destroy you. You handled yourself well tonight, he said. It took her a moment. It actually took her a moment to process the sentence. I handled myself well, she repeated. Yes. In the situation you created. His jaw tightened. Celine. No. Her voice was still quiet, still even. She had not raised her voice at Draven in 7 years of marriage, and she was not going to start tonight in a corridor with cold stone under her feet and the moon watching through the window. No, you don't get to position that as a compliment I should receive graciously. You seated a palace maid at your right hand in front of the full court on the most significant ceremonial night of the Velmoran year. You told me to sit at the secondary table. 200 people watched. Half the continent's gossip network will have it by morning. She stopped. So when you say I handled myself well, Draven, what exactly do you mean? He didn't answer. Do you mean that I didn't cry? She said. That I didn't make a scene? That I sat where you told me and ate my food and smiled at Lady Duran and spoke to Kael about bridge infrastructure while our marriage was being performed for the court as public theater? Is that what I get credit for? That's not... He stopped himself. What? That's not what this is. Then tell me what it is. She watched him. She had watched him in war rooms and on battlefields, and in the dark of their chambers during the years when the wars were ending, and there'd been something almost like ordinary life available to them. She had watched him more closely and with more sustained attention than anyone else alive, and she could not read him tonight. She had not been able to read him for 4 months, and it was that, more than anything else, that had started the thing unraveling inside her chest. I can't, he said. You can't tell me what it is. Not right now. Draven. She kept her voice level through force of will that had physical cost. Her throat tightened with it. I am your mate. I am your Luna. I have bled for this empire alongside you, and I have made decisions that I will carry for the rest of my life in service of this throne and of you, and you cannot tell me what is happening. Not right now, he said again. And there it was. Not coldness, not dismissal. Something else, something that almost read like pain if you stripped away every other possible interpretation and got down to what remained. She stared at him. Okay, she said. The word came out flat and final in a way she hadn't planned. Okay. She turned back to the window. After a moment, she heard him leave. She stood at the window for a long time after that. The moon held its position in the sky with total indifference to what was happening beneath it. Outside in the courtyard, one of the night guards crossed below her window with a torch, and his footsteps were the only sound for a while, regular and unremarkable, and she tracked them until they disappeared into the far archway and left the courtyard empty. The thing inside her chest that had been cracking since she walked into the banquet hall held together for exactly as long as she was standing at that window. Then she pressed her forehead against the cold stone of the window frame and closed her eyes and let herself feel the full weight of it for 30 seconds. Exactly. Because that was all she could afford. On 31, she straightened up, fixed her posture, and went back inside. The weeks that followed the Moon Ascension banquet had the quality of a controlled burn, the kind you use to clear old growth and prevent worse fire later, except no one was controlling this one, and the direction of spread was unclear. Celine moved through the Citadel in a state of functional efficiency that she recognized from her war years as a form of psychological triage. Keep moving. Process later. There was always a later. Except in war, the enemy was outside. The whispers started within 48 hours of the banquet. That was faster than she'd expected, though she should not have expected otherwise. Courts ran on information differentials, and the Moon Ascension seating had been a significant information event. Who you sat beside the throne was a statement. What that statement meant was subject to interpretation, but the interpretations being circulated through the Citadel's antechambers and dressing rooms and servant passages were not, on the whole, favorable to Celine. She heard fragments. She always heard fragments. The life of a Luna was built on the capacity to receive partial information and construct the full picture, because no one ever told you everything directly. The Alpha King has taken a favorite. The Luna has been displaced. Draven grows tired of a woman who thinks like a general. Selene cannot give him heirs. There, that's the root of it. That last one was the sharpest and also the least true in any simple way. But the least true things were often the ones that spread fastest, because they contained a particular kind of ugliness that the human appetite for pattern recognition found satisfying. She had not produced heirs in 7 years. Whether this was a biological matter, a timing matter, a matter of the relentless wars and the medical realities those imposed, was not a question the court whispers bothered themselves with. The simple narrative was simple enough. She dealt with it the way she dealt with everything, by working. She spent 12 to 14 hours a day in her council chamber, moving through the administrative infrastructure of the empire that she had been managing for 6 years with a level of competence that had grown from necessity into something closer to expertise. Trade disputes, border negotiations, the Grey Vial Bridge, which she pushed through the infrastructure committee by calling in a favor from Councillor Adis that she'd been holding for a more significant moment, but used here because Kael had been right about the winter supply implications. The eastern trade routes that Lady Harville had asked about, which turned out to involve a complicated 3-party agreement that she untangled over 4 days of correspondence and then presented to the King's Council at the monthly session. Draven attended the council session. He sat at the head of the long council table in the war chamber, and he listened to her present the trade agreement with his hands folded in front of him, and that flat, contained attention that she could not decode. The council approved the agreement. He said nothing specific to her afterward. They walked out of the session in the same direction for approximately 40 feet before their paths diverged, and they went separately into the machinery of the day. This was their life now, parallel operations in the same structure. She had grown up in the borderlands, where the winters were brutal enough that you learned to read weather from 50 miles away, and she kept waiting for the storm to break into something she could name and address. It didn't break. It just held. Kael stayed in the capital for 3 weeks on administrative leave between campaigns. He visited her council chamber most mornings with dispatch updates that could have been sent by courier but weren't, and they talked about the north and the eastern trade routes and the ongoing border tensions with the Craven clans. And sometimes they talked about nothing useful at all, just the logistical texture of the Citadel's daily life, the kind of conversation that was low stakes enough to be genuinely restful. "You're not sleeping," he said one morning, the second week, looking at her across the map table. "I sleep fine." "You have the look." "What look?" "The look you had during the Thornwall campaign when you were running on 4 hours and commanding 600 wolves and making it look sustainable." She didn't say anything. "It wasn't sustainable then either," he said. "I'm fine, Kael." "You keep saying that, because it's what I have." He looked at her for a moment with that direct, unperforming attention that she had grown to depend on in a way she hadn't examined too closely, because the examination would lead somewhere she wasn't prepared to go right now. He was a general and her longest-standing ally in this court, and her friend, and she kept it there, in that careful taxonomy, because taxonomies were how you maintained the shapes of things when everything else was threatening to go formless. "The court is saying things," she said. "I know what the court is saying." "Does it bother you, being associated with me right now?" "That's an insult dressed up as a question," he said, "and you know it." She looked at the map. The Grey Vial Bridge was marked with a small notation in her handwriting. "Fix by the first snow." "I'm testing it. Everyone else is recalibrating their proximity to me. I'm just checking where you land." "I land where I've always landed," Kael said. "Next to you. That's not political. That's a position I chose." She heard something in that and let it pass without acknowledgement, because she was very tired and she was not in a condition to receive things that required careful handling. The third week, Draven began holding separate council meetings from which she was not excluded but was not informed in advance. She heard about the first one through Councillor Marveth, who mentioned a policy discussion about the northern garrison allocations in a tone that assumed Selene had been present. She hadn't. She discovered there had been 3 such meetings over the preceding fortnight, all touching on military policy areas that had historically been her co-domain. She went to Draven that evening. He was in the strategy room, a narrow chamber off the main war room that held the Empire's master maps and the long histories of every campaign Velmora had fought. He was standing at the Velmora Craven border map with a glass of dark wine and the expression of a man deep inside a problem he hadn't fully solved. "The Northern Garrison allocation sessions," she said from the doorway. "I should be included." He turned. He looked at her. "It's an internal security review," he said. "I've participated in every internal security review since the end of the Western Wars. You established the protocol together with me 3 years ago, specifically to integrate Luna Authority into the military decision chain. The protocol needs to be evaluated." She stood in the doorway and looked at him, and felt the thing in her chest crack another inch, and not from grief this time, but from something colder, from the recognition of a pattern. "Are you removing me from the Security Council?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm evaluating the protocols." "Draven, don't speak to me in that language, not in private. We can do it in front of the court if you need to, but in this room, right now, tell me directly, are you removing me from the Security Councils?" He was quiet for a long moment. The map stretched behind him, all the Empire's borders and territories and pressure points where the wolves of Elmore held back the various forces that wanted to push in and take whatever they could reach. "Temporarily," he said. She held that word in her mind and looked at him. "For your protection," he said very quietly. She left the strategy room. She walked to the outer corridor and then to the training courtyard because the Citadel's interior had started to feel like it was pressing inward, and she stood in the cold night air with her hands at her sides and her breathing controlled, and she thought, "For your protection, for your protection." While he seated someone else at his right hand, while the court concluded she was being displaced, while her council access was quietly reduced, and her authority was handed back to her through the word temporarily, like a loan she hadn't asked for. She thought, "I don't know if I believe you." And then she thought, "I don't know which is worse, that you're lying or that you're not." She was still in the courtyard when Kael found her, 20 minutes later, having apparently tracked her through 2 corridors and the inner garden the way a man did when he'd known someone's movement patterns for long enough that finding them was less a search and more an instinct. "Come inside," he said. "It's too cold." "I'm a wolf." "You're a wolf standing in a training courtyard at the second hour of the night in your council clothes." She turned to look at him. He was in his campaign jacket, rough worn leather that had seen actual field use, and he looked like himself, not the court version, not the formal title version, just Kael, who she had stitched up in a field tent in the 4th year of the wars, and who had never, in all the years since, once pretended that any situation was other than exactly what it was. "He said it's for my protection," she said. Kael's face did something, very small, very controlled. "Did he explain what that means?" Kael said. "No." "Did you ask?" He shut the conversation down before I could press further. She looked at him. You said Draven is not a stupid man." "I said that." "Is there something you know, Kael? Because I need you to tell me right now if there is. I cannot operate like this. I am running this empire on functional autopilot while my husband humiliates me publicly and removes my authority privately and tells me it's for my protection, and I cannot keep moving through this without knowing what I'm actually inside of." Kael was quiet for a long moment. The training yard was cold and still around them, the sand dark and dry under the night sky. "There have been rumors," he said finally, "not confirmed, out of the Eastern Intelligence Network, about a threat to the royal bloodline." She was very still. "What kind of threat?" "Targeted, specific. The kind that doesn't come through the front door." "Assassination." "Possibly. The intelligence is incomplete. I don't have confirmation." "How long have you known about this?" 2 months. But Celine, I have no reason to believe it's connected to 2 months. She did the math automatically, without having to think about it. 2 months ago was when Draven's behavior had shifted, when the distance had begun, when the court had started watching the angle between them change. Kael looked at her. He wasn't telling her the connection was real. He was also not telling her it wasn't. She stood in the cold training yard and understood, in the slow and devastating way that genuine understanding worked. Not fast, not like a blow, but like water coming through cracked stone, finding every fault line. That if this was what it looked like, then Draven had watched her suffer for 4 months in front of the entire empire, had let her stand at the secondary table and lose council access, and watched the court recalibrate away from her, had held her at that 6-foot distance in the corridor and told her I can't, and had done all of it in the belief that it was keeping her safe, that the humiliation was the protection, that destroying what they had was his method of preserving what she was. She felt something shift in the locked and sealed place inside her chest where she had been storing the grief and the fury and the 4 months of held together. It didn't break open. It was quieter than that, more permanent. It calcified. "Kael," she said. "Yes." If that's what he's doing, she stopped, tried again. If he believed I was in danger, and his response was to make me appear worthless to the throne while keeping me in the dark, if his method of protection was to let me drown, Celine. "That's not love," she said. "That might be strategy. That might even be, I don't know what it is, but it is not love. It is not what you do to the person you have sworn yourself to." Kael held her gaze. "No," he said quietly. "It's not." She breathed. The cold of the courtyard moved through her, and she stood in it and let it. "The Blood Moon Assembly is in 12 days, she said. "Yes. I will stand in that assembly beside the king as Luna, as I am obligated to, and I will endure whatever form the next 12 days take. And then—" She stopped. "And then what?" Kael said. She looked at him. The thing in her chest was very quiet now, very still. The kind of still that happened when a decision had already been made at a level below conscious thought, and the surface of you was simply waiting to catch up. "And then something is going to change," she said, "one way or another." Kael looked at her for a long moment. He didn't say don't. He didn't say be careful. He didn't say anything that would have come from a man who was watching her from a distance and calculating his own position relative to the fallout. He said, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." She nodded once. Above them, the moon was already 3 days past full and moving into its waning phase, and the Blood Moon Assembly was 12 days ahead, and in 12 days the full court of Velmora would gather in the Wolf's Arena for the most sacred communal ceremony in the Empire's calendar, the one conducted in front of every wolf, every pack leader, every soldier and noble and servant and stone farmer that Velmora contained, under open sky, with the blood moon burning red overhead. The one ceremony where the mating bond between an alpha king and his Luna could be publicly witnessed, publicly confirmed, or publicly broken. Celine looked at the moon. She had not yet made the decision, not fully. She told herself that. She needed 12 more days and whatever those days revealed. She needed to know if there was something left to save, or if she was already standing in the ruin of it without a proper map. But the calcification in her chest was cold and certain, and it had a shape now. And that shape was not reconciliation. The training yard was silent around her. Somewhere above the walls, one of the watchtower wolves shifted on his post, and the sound of his boots on stone was the only thing moving in the night. 12 days. She turned and walked back inside. But 3 days later, a sealed letter arrived at Celine's council chamber. No seal she recognized, no signature. 6 words only, written in a hand that had been deliberately altered to avoid identification. "The maid is already gone." Too late. Celine read the letter 3 times. The first time her eyes moved across the 6 words, and her brain processed them as language before it processed them as meaning. The second time, the meaning arrived fully, and she felt her heartbeat do something sharp and irregular, a single off-rhythm knock against her ribs that she would not have been able to prevent even if she'd had warning. The third time she read it slowly, as a document, examining the paper quality, the ink weight, the deliberate unsteadiness of the altered hand, the absence of any identifying mark beyond the content itself. The maid is already gone. Too late. Gone meaning what? Gone from the Citadel. Gone from Velmora. Gone from living. She set the letter flat on her council table and put both hands on the table surface and stood there for a moment looking at the wall. The wall was stone, like everything in the Citadel was stone, and it offered nothing back. The question the letter raised was not the one that would occur to most people in her position. Most people would have asked, "Who sent this?" Or, "What does it mean for Lyra?" Or even the generous interpretation, "Does this mean Draven's strategy, whatever it was, has already failed?" Celine's question was simpler and colder. Who knew enough to send it to me? Because that was the actual information, not the content, the targeting. Someone in this Citadel, or close enough to it, had decided that Celine needed to have this letter, at this moment, in this form. That was a choice made by someone with access, awareness, and an agenda. Those three things together made the letter far more significant than its 6 words. She folded it and put it in the interior pocket of her work jacket, against her ribs, and went back to the dispatch on the eastern trade routes she'd been reviewing before the courier arrived. She worked for 2 more hours. Then she went to find Kyle. He was in the Northern Wing Armory, running inventory with 2 of his officers, the kind of operational task generals did when they were in the capital and needed their hands occupied with something concrete. He looked up when she came in and read her face in approximately 1 second and said to his officers, "Give us the room." And they left without comment because Kyle had that quality of authority that produced immediate compliance without requiring volume or explanation. She handed him the letter. He read it, his jaw set. "When did this arrive?" 2 hours ago, sealed courier. The entry log will show a city dispatch, but whoever sent it would have used a relay. You think it's internal? I think it requires internal knowledge, Lyra's situation specifically, and that I would be the relevant recipient. She watched him. How much of what you told me 3 nights ago have you shared with anyone? No one. Not even your officers. No one, he said again. She believed him. That left a smaller pool, and the pool's shape was uncomfortable. There's another possibility, Kyle said, that someone is feeding me information deliberately, wanting me to move. Yes. I know. She had already considered this. She'd considered it within the first 30 seconds of reading the letter and had not stopped considering it since. The possibility that this was not a warning, but a prompt. That someone wanted Celine activated, angry, informed, accelerated toward a confrontation, for reasons that had nothing to do with her welfare. So you don't act on it, Kyle said. I didn't say that. He looked at her. I said I know it might be a prompt, she said. That doesn't mean the information is false, and it doesn't change what I already knew before this letter arrived. She paused. If Lyra is gone, wherever gone means, then Draven's strategy, whatever it was, didn't protect her. And if it didn't protect her, then the threat is still active. And if the threat is still active and I'm the target, then you're in danger right now, Kyle said. Isolated, publicly diminished, removed from the Security Council. Exactly the kind of target that's easy to take without it looking like what it is. She held his gaze. Yes, she said. That's the shape of it. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him calculating the same way she was, running the variables through the operational framework that the Northern campaigns had built into both of them. Threat assessment, resource availability, response options, acceptable risk thresholds. The Blood Moon Assembly is 9 days out, he said. 9 days. You can't move before then without it reading as destabilizing. Every noble house in the Empire will be watching. Any significant action from you right now gets interpreted through the frame of a Luna in conflict with her king. I know. Which means 9 days of sitting inside whatever this situation is without being able to address it directly. I know, Kyle. He looked at her. And if the threat moves before the assembly? She didn't answer right away. The armory was cold and smelled of iron and oiled leather, and the particular dry staleness of stored weapons. A smell she had always found clarifying in some functional way, the way you were clarified by things that had no ambiguity in their purpose. Then we deal with it when it moves, she said. He handed the letter back to her. His fingers were careful about it, not touching hers, but close. 9 days, he said. 9 days, she confirmed. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the large chamber that she had shared with Draven for 7 years, and that she had been occupying alone for the past 4 months, and she looked at the stone ceiling in the dark, and she did not think about the letter or the assembly or the tactical geometry of her current position. She thought about the night 7 years ago when she and Draven had taken the mating vow, not in ceremony, the ceremony came later, but in private, in the war camp outside the walls of the fallen Craven stronghold, with blood still drying on both of them, and the campaign finally over. And he had looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and said something that she had never told anyone. Not because it was private, though it was, because she had known from the moment he said it that it would be the thing she'd have to reckon with one day when everything went wrong. He'd said, I don't know how to keep the things I love from getting destroyed by what I am. She had kissed him and told him they'd figure it out together. She lay in the dark and thought about that night and about the 6 words on the letter pressed between the pages of the Eastern Dispatch on her bedside table, and she decided for the last time that she was done figuring things out in the dark without the information she needed. 9 days. She rose before dawn and began preparing for the Blood Moon Assembly. The preparations were not what most would expect from a Luna managing a public marital crisis. She was not planning a scene. She was not building toward a confrontation for its own sake. She was doing what she had always done when a situation clarified itself past the point of strategic ambiguity. She was getting her affairs in order. She spent 3 of the 9 days finalizing the Eastern Trade Agreement and ensuring the implementation protocols were fully documented and transferable. She spent 2 days in quiet consultation with her 2 most reliable council liaisons about the status of the northern supply routes and the Grayville Bridge progress. She wrote formal letters to the 4 pack leaders of the Outer Territories who had direct administrative relationships with the Luna's office, acknowledging the current situation with precisely the level of language that said, "I am aware of what you have heard, and I remain functional," without saying any of that directly. On the 6th day, Draven came to her council chamber. She was at her desk when he arrived. She did not stand. "The assembly preparations are finalized," he said from the doorway. "I know, I reviewed the protocol documents yesterday." He came into the room. He didn't sit. He stood at the near edge of her desk, on the visitor's side, which was its own kind of statement since he was the king and there was no room in the citadel that was not technically his. The positioning put her in the authority seat and him in the position of someone who'd come to speak to her, and she didn't know if he'd done it deliberately or if it was just how the geometry had worked out. "I need you to stand beside me at the assembly," he said. "As Luna." She looked at him. "I am the Luna," she said. "I'll be at the assembly." "Celine." His voice had something in it that it didn't usually carry, a fraying at the edge of the control. "I need you to understand that Lyra is gone," she said. He went completely still. She watched him. She watched the stillness, which was the specific variety of stillness that happened when someone received information they hadn't known you had and was rapidly recalculating. It lasted approximately 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds she learned more about what had actually been happening in her empire than she'd learned in 4 months of observation. His jaw tightened. "Where did you hear that?" "Does it matter?" "Yes, it matters significantly. Who told?" "Someone who wanted me to know," she said, "which tells me that more people are aware of whatever this is than you intended, which means the containment has already failed." He looked at her. The gray eyes were hard and dark, and she could see something moving behind them that she recognized as the thing he did when he was calculating in real time under pressure, the same thing he'd done on battlefields when the information changed and the plan needed to change with it. "She was moved," he said, "for her safety. She was never—" He stopped. "This was never about her, Celine. I need you to understand that." "I do understand that. I need you to understand that what I did was a strategy," she said. "I understand it was a strategy. I understand the shape of it now, Draven. I understand that you believed reducing my visibility and my apparent value to the throne would reduce my value as a target. I understand that you thought making me appear diminished would make me appear not worth assassinating." She paused. "I understand all of that, and I need you to hear me when I say, it doesn't matter." He looked at her. "It doesn't matter," she said again, and the evenness in her voice was real, not performed. Not because the logic was entirely wrong, but because you made that choice alone. You looked at me, at us, and you decided that what we had together was something you could use as a tool without telling me. You decided I was a resource to be managed rather than a partner to be trusted. She watched him. "You humiliated me in front of 200 people, and you let the court tear me apart for 4 months, and you removed my access from the security councils, and you did all of it in the name of protection without once, not once, asking me what I wanted, what I could handle, what I was." The silence that followed had real weight to it, the kind that came from something irreversible being said aloud. "I was trying to keep you alive," he said. Very quiet, very controlled, except the control was costing him visibly now, and she could see it. "I know." The threat was specific. The intelligence indicated they'd move on anyone with direct claim to the royal bloodline. Publicly distancing you from the throne was the fastest way to— Draven. She stood up. Not quickly. Not with theater. Just stood. Because she needed to be standing for this. "I have fought in your wars. I have made decisions that I will carry in my chest for the rest of my life. I have stood in the citadel of this empire and managed its infrastructure and its politics and its alliances while you led its armies. I have never, not once, asked you to protect me by erasing me. His breathing had changed. She could see it in his chest, the slightly elevated rate, the compression of it. What was I supposed to do? He said, not rhetorically. The words had the sound of something that had been held for a long time under significant pressure. Tell you there were assassins targeting the royal bloodline and wait for you to walk into the open? Tell you and watch you refuse every protective measure because you're... He stopped. Because I'm what? Because you don't know how to be protected, he said. Because the moment you know the shape of a threat, you face it. You always face it. And I couldn't watch you face this one. She stood across the desk from him and looked at his face and understood completely, in the specific awful way that she understood things that contained both truth and damage in equal measure. That he was telling her something real. That this wasn't justification. That somewhere inside the strategy and the silence and the 4 months of deliberate erosion was a man who had been genuinely, comprehensively terrified of losing her, and that it had destroyed them anyway. I needed you to trust me, she said. That's all. Just that. He looked at her with the storm-gray eyes, and she could see that he knew it, that the understanding had been there the whole time, and the gap between knowing and doing had been the thing that cracked the foundation. I know, he said. She picked up the Eastern Dispatch from her desk. She held it for a moment and then set it back down. I'll stand beside you at the assembly, she said, because that's my obligation and I'll meet it. But Draven, she looked at him directly. After the assembly, things will change. I don't know what shape the change takes yet, but I need you to understand that what we were before is not what we are now. And I don't know if that's recoverable. Yet he held her gaze. She watched something move through his expression. Not argument, not resistance. Acknowledgement. The kind that came from a man who had already known the answer before asking the question. I know, he said again. Quieter this time. He left. She stood at her desk and looked at the wall and thought, that was the conversation I needed 4 months ago. The Blood Moon Assembly was 3 days out when the Eastern Intelligence Network delivered its confirmation. Kale brought it to her directly, arriving at her chamber at the second hour of the night with road dust on his jacket and the specific tightness around his eyes that she'd learned to read as serious and urgent rather than serious and manageable. He set the intelligence report on her desk without preamble. She read it. The assassination network was not external. That was the first thing. Not the Craven clans, not the Eastern Border Lords, not any of the foreign powers that Velmora had spent years building walls against. The network was internal, threaded through the mid-tier nobility, funded through obscured trade allocations, organized around a single objective. Remove the Luna and destabilize the royal bloodline, not the king, the Luna. Why me specifically, she said. Because you're the operational authority. Kyle was standing at the window, his back to her for a moment before he turned. The king makes strategic decisions. You execute them. You're the one who actually understands how the empire runs on a daily basis. The assessment is that removing you is more destabilizing in practical terms than removing Draven, because he'd still be alive and functional, but operating without the administrative infrastructure you've built. She absorbed that. It was a deeply uncomfortable thing to absorb. Not because it implied danger, but because it implied a level of operational significance that she had spent 7 years building quietly, below the line of visibility, and someone had been watching closely enough to accurately assess it. They know how the Empire works, she said. Better than most of the official council, Kyle said, which means the source is internal to the council structure. She looked at the report. The assembly. It's the only time the full court is gathered outside the Citadel walls, open sky, traditional security protocols that date back 200 years and weren't designed for this kind of threat vector. He paused. It's the obvious moment. She set the report down. She looked at the stone wall and she thought about standing in the Wolf's Arena in 3 days with the blood moon overhead and the full court of Velmora assembled around her, and about the 6 words on that letter, and about Draven saying, I couldn't watch you face this one. He knew this was likely, she said. He's received the same network reports, at least the earlier versions. And his response was to make me look worthless to the throne. She was not angry saying it. The anger had metabolized into something denser and quieter weeks ago. which in theory reduces my value as a target. In theory, Kale said, but the network's assessment is that I'm valuable because of operational function, not throne symbolism, which means making you look symbolically diminished doesn't reduce the operational threat, he said. Yes. She stood up. She walked to the window and stood where Kyle had been standing, looking out at the courtyard. The night was clear, the moon 3 days from full, already carrying the reddish undertone that would deepen into the blood moon by the assembly night. He protected me the wrong way, she said. Yes. For 4 months, the wrong way, and it didn't even work. Kale didn't respond to that directly. There was nothing to say to it that wasn't either an agreement or a comfort, and he had learned years ago that she didn't want comfort when she was processing something operational. She wanted space to reach the conclusion on her own. She reached it. I won't be made into someone's political problem to solve, she said. Quiet. Definitive. Not by an assassination network and not by my own husband. She turned from the window. I'll stand at the assembly. I'll stand where they can see me, and if someone moves, we deal with it when they move. He looked at her. That's deliberately exposing yourself. That's refusing to hide. She held his gaze. There's a difference. He was quiet for a long moment. She could see the calculation running, the same risk assessment he'd run on every campaign, the cold arithmetic of acceptable cost. She watched him arrive at the same place she had. Then I'll be in the inner ring, he said. Personal security. Not official. I'm not on the assembly detail. But I'll be there. Kyle, I'll be there, he said again, and it was not a discussion. She looked at him for a moment. This man who had shown up at every difficult moment, without being asked and without conditions, who had tracked her through 2 corridors and an inner garden because he knew her movement patterns, who had said next to you like it was a coordinate on a map rather than a sentiment, and she felt something complex and unresolved move through her chest. She let it pass without naming it. All right, she said. 3 days. He nodded once. He moved toward the door. Kyle. He stopped. She looked at him across the room. Whatever happens at the assembly, whatever I decide in that arena, I need you to know it's not because I'm... She stopped. I'm not making the decision from grief or from anger. I want you to know that. He looked at her directly. I know what you are, he said. I've known for years. He left. She stood alone in her chamber with the blood moon's first faint color visible through the window, and 3 days between her and the moment that had been building since she'd walked into the Iron Citadel's banquet hall and found a palace maid standing at her king's right hand. She had thought that night that the worst part was not understanding why. She understood now, and the understanding was worse. She opened her desk drawer and took out a single sheet of clean paper. She set it in front of her. She picked up her pen and she sat there for a long moment with the pen above the paper and the moon reddening in the window behind her. Then she began to write. Not to Draven, not to Kael, not to the council or the pack leaders or any of the machinery of Empire that she had been keeping functional for months while everything else collapsed. She wrote to the Wolf's Arena, where the Blood Moon Assembly would be held in 3 days before every wolf in Velmora. She wrote out the ceremony protocol for the mating bond dissolution. She had memorized it years ago, not with any intention of using it, but because she was Celine Valor and she memorized every protocol for every ceremony in every situation because you did not run an empire on optimism. You ran it on preparation. Her hand moved steadily across the paper. The pen made the only sound in the room. The morning of the Blood Moon Assembly arrived with the kind of cold clarity that the Velmoran highlands produced in the deepest part of autumn. Air sharp enough to cut, sky stripped of cloud, the sort of light that left nothing soft and asked nothing polite of the day. Celine had been awake since the 4th hour. She had not gone back to sleep after the 3rd hour because sleep had become unreliable over the past weeks, arriving in fragments and departing without completion, and she had learned to stop fighting its absence and simply use the hours it left her. She dressed without her attendants. She had done this increasingly over the past months, not from suspicion of them specifically, but from a growing need to perform as few rituals as possible in front of witnesses. The act of being dressed and arranged and presented was a ritual of display, and she had been performing enough display without adding to it voluntarily. She put on the dark gray ceremonial armor that she wore for the assembly, not the full warplate, which would have been a statement too loud for even this occasion, but the fitted ceremonial pieces that sat over a charcoal underlayer, the Luna's formal version of military dress. She did her own hair, pulling it back and fixing it with the iron moon clasp. She looked at herself in the polished iron panel and saw what was there. A woman who had slept in fragments and was carrying 4 months of damage behind her eyes, and was walking into an open-air arena with an assassination network threaded through the court, and a dissolution protocol memorized, and a decision that had calcified past the point of revision. She looked functional. She had always been good at looking functional. The Wolf's Arena was 2 miles from the citadel proper, built into the natural bowl of the valley's eastern edge, where the terrain created acoustics that carried a human voice to every corner of the space without artificial amplification. It held 5,000 wolves in the surrounding terraces and standing ground. For the Blood Moon Assembly, every wolf of rank within the Empire's reach was expected to attend, and the outer territories sent representatives when full attendance was logistically impossible. The arena's floor was open earth, packed hard from centuries of use, the color of dark iron in the morning light. At its center stood the Assembly Stone, a flat-topped granite block that predated the Empire by several hundred years and that no one had ever successfully dated or explained. It was simply there, as it had always been, and the ceremonies of Velmora had grown around it the way rivers grew around stone. Celine rode to the arena in the official procession, 3 positions behind Draven in the formal order. Luna's position for the approach, which placed her visible but not adjacent, a symbolic gap that had always been ceremonial and now felt documentary. She rode straight, her hands easy on the reins, and she watched the crowd that had gathered along the processional road, and she thought about nothing specific. Thinking specifically about things right now was a drain she couldn't afford. She needed her attention clear for whatever the next 3 hours held. She found Kyle in the inner ring before the procession dismounted. He was there as he'd said he would be, in the informal position of a general attending on personal observance, not on the official security detail, which would have required Draven's approval, but present in the ring of standing wolves that surrounded the arena floor. He was wearing a campaign jacket, no ceremonial dress. His hand rested near his side in the way it rested when he was actively threat assessing a space. He met her eyes when she passed and gave her a single look that said, "I'm here. I see the room. Stay inside yourself." She looked back at him and said nothing and moved to her assembly position. The ceremony opened with the traditional summoning call, the long horn sequence that rolled across the valley and bounced off the eastern ridge and came back changed, the way echoes always return things altered. And the 5,000 wolves of Velmora settled into the particular focused stillness of a pack gathering under significant sky. The blood moon would peak at midday. The sky overhead was the specific deep blue of Highland autumn, entirely clear, and the moon was already visible as a reddish disk in the western quarter, not yet at zenith, but carrying its full color. It looked like something had injured it. Draven stood at the assembly stone. He was in full ceremonial dress, the deep black of the Viramont line with the gray wolf crest and the high collar and the formal sword at his hip that was never drawn for ceremony but was required to be present. He looked like what he was, a king who had built his throne out of something real and violent and lasting. He looked like he hadn't slept either. She noticed that from 40 feet away and filed it away without feeling anything about it that wasn't already covered by the general weight she'd been carrying for months. She took her position to his left, which was the Luna's side, and she felt the crowd register her presence with the particular ripple of a pack, acknowledging a returning pack member whose status is uncertain. Not hostility, not welcome, something between. The court had spent 4 months watching her diminishment and recalibrating accordingly. And now they were watching her stand at the assembly stone and recalibrating again, and the direction of the new calculation wasn't yet clear. The ceremony moved through its opening stages. Pack acknowledgments, territory declarations, the reading of the Empire's seasonal accounting, births, deaths, territorial changes, resource tallies, which was the practical core of the assembly wrapped in the ceremonial shell that made it feel like more than accounting. Celine stood through it with her hands at her sides, and her face composed and her attention moving across the crowd in the slow, systematic way that Kyle had taught her in the 3rd year of the wars. Grid the space, identify anomalies, return to center, repeat. She was on her 4th pass of the eastern terrace when she found the anomaly. 3 figures in the outer standing section, robes of the mid-tier house colors, nothing that should have stood out, positioned at an angle to the assembly stone that gave sight lines to its left side. Her side. She found Kyle with her eyes. He had already found the 3 figures. He gave her a fractional nod that meant, "I see them. I'm watching." The ceremony continued. The blood moon climbed toward zenith. The air got colder and the light got sharper, and the reddish cast of the moon deepened until it looked like the sky was carrying a wound that refused to close. The attack did not come from the three figures in the eastern terrace. It came from the inner ring. The wolf moved in the gap between the horn call ending and the next ceremonial beat, a window of approximately 4 seconds when the crowd's attention shifted from the horn position to the assembly stone, when every eye moved as a unit and the peripheral coverage dropped. He was wearing official security colors. He had been standing in the inner ring for the full duration of the ceremony, in a position that would have required official clearance to occupy. He had passed whatever vetting the assembly security detail had conducted. He had a blade that was coated with something that wasn't standard iron. The coating had a smell she registered before she fully processed what she was seeing: sharp, chemical, wrong, in a way that bypassed conscious identification and went straight to the animal part of her brain that had been running threat assessment since she first learned to walk through dangerous spaces. He was 6 feet away and moving before the first shout came from the crowd. What happened in the next 40 seconds had the quality that extreme situations always had in her experience. Not slow motion, which was how people who hadn't been in them described it, but hypersequential. Each moment separated from the next by a clarity of detail that normal time didn't produce. She saw the blade. She registered the coating. She made a calculation about distance and trajectory and about the fact that she was not wearing full warplate and her left side was partially exposed above the waist. She moved. She moved wrong. Not catastrophically, but wrong. A fraction of a second's delay because the attacker's approach angle was calibrated for her habitual defensive posture, which told her he had studied her. She took the blade across her left forearm instead of in her side, which was the intended target, and the cut was deep enough that she felt it arrive before she felt the burn of the coating, and she understood in that moment that if the blade had landed where it was aimed, she would not be standing up for the second half of this calculation. Kael hit the attacker from the right before the man could reset for a second strike. What followed was not a fight in any structured sense. It was a general eruption, the three figures in the eastern terrace moving simultaneously with the inner ring attacker's failure, which confirmed the coordination. The official security detail fragmenting between protecting the king, protecting the Luna, and responding to 3 additional threat vectors. 5,000 wolves in the terraces going from ceremonial stillness to pack threat response in approximately 2 seconds, which produced a noise that she would remember for the rest of her life, the sound of a massed wolf pack registering danger at the same instant. Draven transformed. She had seen it before. She had seen it in battle and in the controlled setting of challenge bouts, and once, early in their marriage, in an unguarded moment that had startled her badly even then. The transformation of an alpha king of Draven's lineage was not the smooth shift of the trained pack warrior. It was structural. The change moved through him like something detonating from the inside out. Bones rearranging with a sound she felt in her teeth, mass adding from nowhere and everywhere. The thing in his eyes going from storm gray human calculation to something older and more absolute. He was not a wolf in the storybook sense. He was what the Empire had been built on, what the Viramont line carried in its blood, what the enemies of Velmora had learned over 200 years to run from. He massacred the attackers. It was not a word she chose for drama. It was the accurate word for what occurred in the Wolf's arena in the 12 seconds following the eruption. The 3 figures from the eastern terrace were dead before they reached the assembly floor. The inner ring attacker who had survived Kael's first engagement did not survive Draven's attention. 2 more figures that she hadn't identified in her grid assessment, sleepers positioned deep in the crowd, moving on the eruption as a signal, were stopped before they completed their approach. Blood on the assembly stone, blood on the open earth floor. The blood moon overhead, red as a warning, looking down at the thing it had been named for. Celine stood in the middle of it, with her left arm held tight against her body, and the chemical burn spreading through the wound in a way that told her the coating was slow-acting but real. And she looked at what Draven had done to the people who'd come for her, and she felt something she was not prepared to feel. Not gratitude. She was not ungrateful. She was alive, and she was alive in part because of what he'd just done, and she wasn't stupid about that. But underneath the gratitude was something jagged and specific. He had been able to do this. He had this capacity, this absolute and devastating response to a threat against her, and he had spent 4 months using it not to fight for her, but to perform against her. The same man who had just unmade 6 assassins in 12 seconds had spent 4 months manufacturing her public diminishment and calling it protection. The arena was still erupting around her when he found her. He was still partially shifted, not fully human, the mass and the eye color not yet returned, and there was blood on his hands, and his formal blacks were destroyed, and he grabbed her by her right arm with a force that would have hurt someone who hadn't spent years in the field with bones toughened by it. "How bad?" he said. His voice was rough from the shift, the edges not quite human. "Manageable," she said. "Coated blade. It's slow." His eyes went to her left arm. Something moved through his face that she didn't want to look at too long. "We need to get you to the... Draven." She pulled her right arm back. He let her. "I'm standing up. I'll stay standing. Get the arena contained first." He looked at her for 1 second in which several things moved across his face that were too compressed to separate. Then he turned and began issuing commands to the security detail, which was exactly what she'd told him to do, and which was also a retreat from the look that had been on his face, and she was aware of both of those things simultaneously and was too tired and too chemical burned to do anything with either of them right now. Kyle was at her side within 30 seconds of Draven leaving. "The arm," he said. "I know. We need to flush it before the coating. I know, Kyle, I know." She looked at him. He had blood on his jacket that wasn't his, from the inner ring attacker. His jaw was set, and his eyes were doing the rapid reassessment sweep that meant he was still in operational mode and hadn't fully transitioned down from the threat response. "Are you hit?" "No." "Are you certain?" "Yes." He looked at her arm. "Celine." "There was someone inside the official detail," she said. "The inner ring attacker. He had clearance." Kale's jaw tightened further. "I know. That's not an external network. That's not mid-tier noble money buying a professional. That's someone with access to the assembly security vetting, someone who could place an operative inside the inner ring with legitimate credentials." "Yes," he said. Again. The word had less air in it this time. She looked at him. He was looking at the arena floor. "Who vetted the inner ring detail?" she said. He didn't answer. "Kyle. Who vetted?" "Counselor Marveth coordinates the assembly security protocol," he said, "as he has for the past 6 years." She held that. Counselor Marveth, who had been on the King's Council for 12 years, who had survived the court through Careful, the way Lord Cassian had survived it through Careful, except that Marveth's version of Careful had always had a transactional quality that she'd noted and filed without fully actioning. Who had been the counselor to acknowledge her formal Security Council request, with a routing to the quarterly review? Who had been, she now understood, not routing it for bureaucratic convenience, but ensuring her exclusion was maintained by someone who understood exactly how that exclusion worked. The betrayal didn't hit her the way betrayals hit people in the stories she'd heard growing up, like a blade or a fall or a sudden cold. It arrived the way the worst things actually arrived, as confirmation of something she'd already suspected and had refused, out of some remnant of good faith, to fully believe. She looked at the assembly stone, still marked with the morning's blood, and she thought, it was never fully external. It was always partially inside. The arena was being cleared around them. The official security detail was moving people toward the exits. Draven was at the far end of the floor, coordinating the response with the efficiency of a man who had been in enough crises to know exactly what post-threat management required. And she watched him and understood that everything he was doing right now was correct and competent and completely insufficient. Because in the architecture of what had just happened, Marveth's access to the assembly security detail was a 6-year-old construction. It predated Draven's intelligence about the assassination network. It predated the Moon Ascension banquet, and the 4 months of managed distance and everything Draven had done in the name of protecting her. Which meant that while Draven had been building a strategy to reduce her visibility as a target, someone inside the council had been building a strategy to place the blade at the correct angle, regardless of her visibility. The protection had failed not because the logic was entirely wrong. It had failed because the threat was never outside the walls in the way Draven had mapped it. It had been inside. It had been attended council sessions and signed administrative protocols and stood in this arena with legitimate credentials, and the whole architecture of her humiliation had been constructed in response to a threat model that missed the actual shape of the threat. Celine stood in the wolf's arena with 5,000 wolves clearing out around her, and a chemical burn working slowly through her left arm, and the blood moon red overhead, and she felt the last calcified piece of her patience crack through. Not into grief, not into rage, which would have been easier to manage, into clarity, the kind of clarity that came when every alternative had been exhausted and what remained was not a choice between options, but a recognition of what had already been decided by the weight of accumulated facts. She had been running an empire from within a marriage that was using her as both asset and liability simultaneously. She had been managed, protected, diminished, and nearly killed by external threats and internal failures, and the man who claimed to love her employing the same toolkit for all three without fully understanding the difference. She could not continue inside this structure, not as it was, not as it had been for 4 months, not as it would be after today, with Marveth's name in the intelligence report and the security detail's inner ring compromised, and the whole court having watched the Blood Moon Assembly erupt into violence at the Luna's position. She looked across the arena at Draven. He had finished the immediate containment and turned back toward her, and their eyes met across the open ground of the assembly floor, and she held his gaze from across the distance, and she let him see her face clearly for the first time in 4 months. Not the composed face, not the functional face. The actual face, which had the look of someone who has arrived at the end of a calculation and found there's only one number at the bottom. He went very still. He knew. She could see that he knew. She turned away from him and walked to the assembly stone, which was still the only fixed point in the arena, still ancient and indifferent and present the way it had always been. She put her right hand on its surface and felt the cold of the granite and the deep vibration of something in it that wasn't temperature. The specific resonance of a stone that had witnessed every ceremony of this empire for 200 years and was about to witness one more. The crowd had not fully cleared. The pack, by instinct, was stopping. Wolves were turning back toward the floor. Something in the atmosphere of the arena was signaling that the event was not over. Not the threat response, not the security evacuation, but something else. Something that required witnesses. She looked up at the blood moon. Behind her, she heard Draven's footsteps cross the assembly floor. He stopped 6 feet away. The same 6 feet as the corridor, the same distance he'd been holding for 4 months, and now at the end of everything it was still 6 feet, and she understood that the gap between them had never been tactical. It had always been the exact size of what he couldn't say. She turned to face him. She raised her right hand and placed it against her chest, above her heart, where the mating bond lived in the specific warm pressure way that she had stopped being able to feel clearly over the past months. Not gone. Still there, still real. Still the thing that had been true between them since the war camp outside the Craven stronghold, since the night he'd said, "I don't know how to keep the things I love from getting destroyed by what I am." He had been right, 9 years ago, and neither of them had known how true it was. She looked at him. His face was everything. Grief and fury, and the terrible open quality of a man who has run out of strategies and is left with only the thing underneath, which was real and always had been and was not, as it turned out, enough. "Celine," he said. Her name, just that. The only word he had left. She held his gaze, her hand pressed flat against her chest, and in front of 5,000 wolves under the blood moon of Velmora, she began to pull. The bond broke on the third pull. Not like a rope snapping, not like anything she had been told to expect because no one told you what it actually felt like. No ceremony protocol described it in honest terms, only in the ritual language of elevation and transformation that covered the reality the way formal dress covered damage. The reality was physical. A tearing sensation that started in her sternum and moved outward through her ribcage in both directions simultaneously, like something that had been load-bearing for 7 years being removed from the structure all at once. Her vision whited at the edges. Her knees didn't buckle, she didn't allow that. But the ground felt suddenly unreliable under her feet, the packed earth of the assembly floor no longer the fixed point it had been 60 seconds ago. She heard Draven. The sound he made was not human and not wolf. It was something in between, something that belonged to the specific register of an alpha king losing a mating bond, which was a physiological event as much as an emotional one. She had known this intellectually. The intellectual knowledge did not prepare her for the sound itself, which came from somewhere below language, below strategy, below everything he'd spent 33 years building on top of whatever he'd been before the wars made him. He went to one knee. Not slowly. The way a structure went when a support was removed, immediate, total, the body following the physics of what had just happened before the mind could organize a response. She did not look away from him. She owed him that much. She stood at the assembly stone with blood on her left arm and the burn of the coating working deeper, and the white clearing gradually from the edges of her vision, and she looked at him on one knee on the assembly floor with 5,000 witnesses, and she felt the grief and the clarity in equal measure, and did not perform either of them for the crowd. After 4 seconds he raised his head. His eyes were fully shifted, the storm gray gone entirely, replaced by the pale light of the Alpha's wolf sight, which happened under emotional extremity, and which meant he was operating on something below rational calculation right now. He looked at her from that pale-eyed place, and she looked back at him, and the distance between them was exactly 6 feet and felt like geography. Celine. Her name again. He said it differently this time. Older. "It's done," she said, her voice held. "Let it be done." He stayed on one knee for another 2 seconds. Then he stood. The physical act of standing was the most Draven thing she had ever watched him do. The absolute refusal to stay down regardless of the cost of getting up, the will overriding the physiology, the king overriding the man. He stood up straight and his jaw set and his eyes were still pale and wild, and he looked at her with something in his face that she was going to carry for the rest of her life, whether she wanted to or not. Then he turned away from her. The roar that moved through the wolf's arena was not approval and not condemnation. It was the sound of 5,000 wolves processing an event that had no precedent in the Empire's living memory. A Luna dissolving the royal mating bond at the Assembly Stone under the blood moon, with the arena still marked from an assassination attempt, with the king still wearing blood on his hands from the defense of the woman who was currently rejecting him. There was no existing framework for this. The crowd was doing what crowds did without framework, making sound to fill the space where understanding should have been. Celine walked off the assembly floor. She walked steadily with her left arm held close to her body and her face arranged and her spine carrying the load, and she walked until she was through the arena's eastern gate and in the corridor beyond, and then she put her back against the stone wall and closed her eyes and breathed for 15 seconds without managing anything for anyone. Kael found her in 45 seconds. He was carrying a field kit from somewhere. She didn't ask where, didn't particularly care, and he took her left arm with both hands and looked at the wound with the efficient grimness of a man who had assessed injuries under worse conditions. "I need to flush this now," he said. "Yes." He worked fast and without comment. The flush burned worse than the coating had, which she had expected, and she kept her breathing even and looked at the stone wall while he worked and thought about nothing at all until he was done and had the arm wrapped. "How much did you absorb?" he said. "Not a full dose. The blade hit arm, not torso. Probably 30% of what they intended. You'll feel it for 3 days. Fatigue and I know what it does, Kael." He looked at her. She looked back at him. His face had the tightness of a man who had watched something very difficult from 6 feet away and had not been permitted to intervene in the part that wasn't an assassination attempt. "I heard," he said. Everyone heard. "Yes. Are you—" "I'm functional," she said. "What's the status of the arena?" He accepted the redirect. "Draven's people have the floor contained. Marvith is in custody. Draven moved on him within 5 minutes of the attempt. I don't know if he had the intelligence already, or if the inner ring operative's credentials gave him enough to act. Does it matter? It matters for what he knew and when." She thought about that. "He knew before the assembly. He moved on Marvith after I dissolved the bond. Not before." She looked at the wall. "He let the assembly happen. He may have calculated that moving on Marveth before the assembly would tip the remaining network." "I know." She did know. She even understood the calculation. The understanding had stopped being the point. What's left of the network? Unknown. Marveth's the center of it, but networks don't die with their centers. They fragment. The fragmentation is going to be unpredictable. Which means the next 30 days are going to be the most dangerous period the Empire has had since the end of the Western Wars. Yes. She closed her eyes briefly. She had known this. She had known it when she put her hand against her chest at the assembly stone. She had done it anyway because the alternative was to remain inside a structure that had been hollowed out from the inside, and that would not hold its shape regardless of whether she stayed or left. You could not save a building by living in the ruins. You could only decide what to build on the cleared ground. "I need to leave the capital," she said. Kael was quiet for a moment. "Where?" "North, your garrison, the Frostwall territories. Somewhere outside the immediate Citadel political geometry where I can—" She stopped. restarted. Where I can be something other than what I've been here. He looked at her carefully. You're not running. No, I'm repositioning. She met his eyes. There's a difference. He held her gaze for a long moment and then nodded once, the way he nodded when a tactical decision had been assessed and accepted. I'll need a week to arrange the Northern Command transfer, he said. Bryn can hold the Frostwall position, but the broader territorial administration. I'll take the broader territorial administration, Celine said. He stared at her. I've been running the Citadel's administrative infrastructure for 6 years, she said. The Northern Territories need the same functions. Supply chains, border negotiations, resource allocation, local pack management. I know how to do all of it. She paused. And I won't be doing it inside someone else's strategy. I'll be doing it as myself. A beat of silence. Then something shifted in Kael's face. Not surprise exactly, but the recognition of something clicking into place. All right, he said. She pushed off the wall. The left arm throbbed steadily under the wrapping, the remaining coating working at the edges of the flush, and her chest still carried the ghost of the torn bond's absence, a negative space where the warmth had been, like the ground-level cold that remained after a fire went out. She was going to feel that absence for a long time. She knew that. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But she could stand up. She had always been able to stand up. The week that followed was the worst week the Empire had seen in a decade, and Celine moved through it with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that there was no option of stopping to process anything until the immediate structural crisis was addressed. Marveth's arrest triggered the network's fragmentation exactly as Kael had predicted. 3 noble houses that had been funding the operation through obscured trade allocations made simultaneous moves. 2 toward formal withdrawal from the Imperial Council. 1, Lord Broden of the Eastern Cliffs, toward open challenge of the throne's authority over the Grey Peak territories. The challenge was not military yet. It was legal and bureaucratic and full of the specific bad faith of a man testing whether the structure was weak enough to push. It was the kind of challenge that Celine had been handling on behalf of the throne for 6 years, and she handled it now from inside the Citadel's administrative chamber with the Eastern dispatch files and the trade agreement she'd finalized, and the network of correspondence she'd been maintaining. In 48 hours, she had produced a legal response to Broden's challenge that closed every procedural avenue he'd attempted and left him 2 options, formal submission or open rebellion. He submitted. It was not because he was afraid of Celine personally. It was because the response she'd produced was airtight in a way that only happened when someone had spent years learning exactly where the pressure points were. Draven received the submission report without comment. He was operating in the Citadel in a parallel state, present, functional, crushing the remaining network elements with the systematic efficiency of a man who had converted grief entirely into work. She saw him twice in the first 3 days, both times in passing corridors. Both times they looked at each other with the specific, careful attention of people who share a space that has been permanently reorganized and are still learning the new floor plan. On the 4th day, he came to her chamber. She was packing, not dramatically, just the practical sorting of what needed to come with her to the north and what stayed in the Citadel's Luna chambers for whatever function they'd serve now. She was standing at the document chest when he came in, and she turned and looked at him and waited. He looked at the packed cases, then at her. Broden's submission is clean, he said. Your response was... He stopped. It was good work. I know. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd been carrying in her chest for the past 4 days, the open, stripped-down quality that had replaced the sealed-door look of the past 4 months, and that was harder to be in the same room with somehow than the sealed door had been. I'm going to address the Eastern Noble withdrawals with a formal council restructure, he said. Remove the positions Marveth controlled and redistribute the oversight. It's going to be a 3-month process. You'll need someone to manage the administrative transition while the restructure happens, she said. The council's load doesn't reduce during a restructure. It increases. I know. Counselor Addis can carry part of it. She's reliable and she understands the trade infrastructure, but she'll need Celine. He said her name the way you said a name when you weren't trying to stop a conversation, but to bring it to the actual point. I'm not here about the council restructure. She set down the document she was holding. She turned to face him fully. I know why you made the decision you made at the assembly, he said. I'm not asking you to explain it. I understand it. Good. I'm asking you... He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment with the specific quality of a man who has been articulate his entire life and has arrived at a place where the available words are insufficient. I'm asking if there's anything left after the North, after whatever you're building up there. If there's anything, I don't know, she said. She said it directly and without softening it because he deserved the direct version even when the direct version was insufficient. I genuinely don't know, Draven, and I can't give you an answer that I don't have. He held her gaze. Something moved through his face. Okay, he said. She looked at him. He was 33 years old, and he had just lost a mating bond and survived an assassination network operating inside his own council, and was standing in her chamber asking her a question he already knew might not have an answer, and he was standing up straight. He was always standing up straight. She had loved that about him, and been made angry by it, and been sustained by it, and been damaged by its application in the wrong direction, and she looked at him and felt all of those things simultaneously, and let none of them change the shape of what she'd decided. The Greyvale Bridge, she said. He looked at her. The construction approval went through last week, she said. The crew will start before the first snow. It'll be done by spring. She paused. The Frostwall winter supply delivery will be on time. Something shifted in his face, very small, very real. Good, he said. He left. She stood in the room for a moment after he was gone, and she breathed, and she did not feel the warmth in her chest where the bond had been, and she told herself, as she had been telling herself for 4 days, that the absence was not only loss, that some things had to be cleared before ground could hold anything new, that the cold of cleared ground in autumn was not the same as the cold of nothing, and she needed to learn the difference. She went back to packing. She left the capital on the 7th morning after the assembly, before the court was fully awake, which was a choice that was partly practical and partly the recognition that a formal departure would produce a ceremony she didn't have the resources for right now. Kyle rode with her. He brought 12 of his northern wolves, the ones who had been with him through the full campaign and whom she had known long enough to trust the way you trusted people you'd been through bad weather with. The road north was cold and clear, and she rode it with her wrapped arm carried carefully, and the ghost of the bond's absence steady in her chest and her face turned toward the highland passes that marked the beginning of Kyle's territory. The Frostwall garrison received her without fanfare and without protocol, which was the northern way. These were frontier wolves who assessed a person on what they could do and not on what they'd left behind, and she understood on arrival that this was part of why she'd chosen it. She was not the Luna here. She was not Draven's wife, or Draven's strategy, or Draven's managed asset, or any of the things she'd been in the Citadel's complicated machinery. She was a woman who knew how to run a territory's administrative infrastructure, and who had arrived with road dust on her jacket and a partially healed arm, and the look of someone who intended to work. The garrison commander, Bryn, was a broad-shouldered wolf of 40 with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had been lived in hard. She assessed Celine in approximately 4 seconds and said, "I heard about the assembly." "Yes," Celine said. "You broke the bond at the stone." "Yes." Bryn was quiet for a moment, then, "The eastern supply route needs renegotiating. The winter contract's been running on terms that haven't been updated in 3 years, and the carrier is taking advantage." "Show me the current contract," Celine said. Bryn almost smiled. "Come inside." The first month in the north was the hardest physically, because the arm healed slower than expected, the coating's residual effects making the wound stubborn. And because the Frostwall territory's administrative situation was worse than she'd understood from Citadel dispatches, which was always the case when you were reading reports from a distance versus sitting inside the reality. But she worked, and the work was the thing that had always steadied her, the thing that existed on the same side of the line as survival and purpose, and the specific satisfaction of a problem solved by someone who understands it clearly. She renegotiated the Eastern supply contract in the 3rd week. She restructured the winter delivery routes in the 4th. She spent the 5th week reviewing the pack management records for the 6 northern territories that fell under the Frostwall administrative umbrella, and identified 3 significant resource allocation errors that had been compounding for 2 years unaddressed. Kyle worked beside her, not subordinate. They had always been equals in the functional sense, and here, away from the Citadel's hierarchy, that equality was cleaner and more honest. He handled the military operations and the pack security and the border monitoring. She handled everything else. It was a clear division, and it worked, and neither of them commented on how naturally it had settled into place. In the sixth week, the Citadel dispatches arrived with the news that two of the eastern noble houses that had withdrawn from the council had formally aligned with the remnant of Marveth's network, and were making approaches to the Craven clans across the border. Alliances, resources, the beginnings of an organized pressure campaign against a throne they'd calculated as weakened. She read the dispatches at the garrison table with the morning fire going, and her breath visible in the cold air, and Kael across from her reading the same reports. "He's going to have to fight them," Kael said. "He knows how to fight," she said. "That was never the problem. He's going to be fighting on 3 fronts simultaneously: Eastern Noble Challenge, Craven border pressure, internal council restructure." "I know." Kael looked at her across the table. She could see him choosing his next words carefully, which he didn't always bother with when they were working. "The military situation on the Eastern Front is going to require—" He stopped. Restarted. "The administrative support for a 3-front engagement is not something the Citadel can run without." "I know, Kael. I'm not asking you to go back." "I know you're not." They looked at each other. The fire moved. Outside the garrison walls, the first serious snow of the season was coming down in the steady, committed way that meant it intended to stay. "I'm not going back to what I was," she said. "I want that to be clear. Whatever happens next, I'm not walking back into the Luna's chamber and running the Empire from behind the throne as someone's administrative asset. That's over." "Yes," he said. "I know. But the Empire I helped build is going to collapse if the Eastern Front isn't managed correctly, and—" She stopped, looked at the dispatch. "And I'm not willing to watch it collapse when I know how to stop it." Kael was quiet. "I need different terms," she said. "Independent authority over the military territories. My own command structure. No subordination to the council. Answerable to the throne for military outcomes only." She paused. "Those are not negotiable." "You'll have to negotiate them with Draven." "Yes." "Which means going back to the capital." "Temporarily." She looked at the fire. "For the negotiation, and then—" She thought about the cleared ground, about the cold that was not the same as nothing. "And then we see what holds." He looked at her with the expression she'd been not naming for months, direct and unhurried, and carrying something that she kept filing under friend, general, ally, because those categories were true, and were also, she understood now in the cold clarity of the northern garrison, not the complete picture. She didn't address it, not yet. There were too many things ahead that needed the attention she had, and she was not going to shortchange any of them by moving faster than the ground could support. "When do you want to ride south?" he said. "After the snow clears," she said. 2 days, maybe 3. He nodded. She picked up the dispatch and read it again. The Eastern Noble alignment with the Craven clans had a shape she recognized. Not a sudden alliance, but the acceleration of something that had been building for years. The way all the real collapses were actually slow processes that looked sudden at the moment they became visible. The Craven clans were organized and patient, and had been waiting for exactly this kind of window. A Velmoran throne managing internal fractures simultaneously with a border pressure campaign. They would not waste it, and Draven would be managing all of it while carrying the bond's absence in his chest, the same way she was carrying it in hers. That negative space, that cold where warmth had been, that she had told herself was not only loss. She believed that. She still believed it. But she was also, for the first time in 4 months, beginning to understand that belief and damage could coexist in the same chest, and that the coexistence was not failure. It was just the actual shape of surviving something real. The snow came down outside the garrison walls, and she sat by the fire and read dispatches and planned and did not look at the empty place in her chest too long, because the North had taught her already that you managed cold by keeping your hands occupied and your eyes on the ground in front of you. 2 days. 3 at most. Then south. The Eastern Front was not going to wait. On the morning of the 3rd day, before she could give the order to ride, the fastest courier in the Frostwall relay system arrived at the garrison gate with a sealed dispatch marked with Draven's personal seal, and the emergency protocol notation that meant open immediately. This does not wait for anything. She broke the seal. She read it. She read it again. The Craven clans had not waited for the window to open fully. They had moved 3 days ago, not on the eastern border where everyone had been watching, but through the Hollow Vale passage that the Greyvale Bridge rerouting had temporarily deprioritized, the exact passage that had been drawing local traffic while the main route was under construction. A force of 4,000, moving fast and quiet through the one gap in the border, monitoring that the restructure had left temporarily underwatched. They were 60 miles south of the Frostwall garrison. Moving toward the capital. She looked up from the dispatch. Kyle was in the doorway. He had a second copy of the same report in his hand. The military channel ran parallel to the administrative one, and his face had the particular stillness of a general who has received information that requires immediate large-scale response and is already running the numbers. Their eyes met. "How fast can we move?" she said. "Hard ride, full contingent? We could intercept at the Thorn Pass Narrows before they clear the Highland Edge." He paused. "If we leave in the next 2 hours." "Then we leave in the next 2 hours." "Celine." He said it the way you said someone's name when you needed them to hear the thing underneath the tactical layer. "If we move on the Craven advance and the Eastern Noble Alliance reads it as the Luna returning to defend the throne, I'm not returning to defend the throne," she said. She was already moving toward the equipment room. "I'm defending the people between 60 miles south and the capital who didn't make any of the decisions that led to this." She looked back at him once. "Get your wolves ready." He looked at her for 1 second in which everything that had been building for 6 weeks in the northern garrison, and for much longer before that was visible in his face. Not said, just visible, carried in plain sight the way the truest things were carried. "Yes," he said, "let's go." The garrison erupted into pre-ride preparation around her, the controlled chaos of wolves who knew what was coming and had been trained for it, and she moved through it pulling on her campaign gear with the burned arm holding and her chest carrying both the absence and the decision simultaneously, and she thought, "This is what you are." Not the Luna standing at the secondary table, not the woman in the corridor with her forehead against the cold stone, not the figure at the assembly stone pulling the warmth from her own chest before 5,000 witnesses. This, moving fast towards something difficult because the alternative was to stand still while it came to you. The horses were ready. The Thorn Pass Narrows were 60 miles south, and the Craven force was already moving, and somewhere behind them, in a capital that didn't know yet what was coming through the Hollowvale Passage, Draven was managing 3 simultaneous crises without the administrative infrastructure she'd spent 6 years building, and the empire they'd made together was about to find out whether it could survive the cost of what they'd done to each other. She rode out of the Frostwall garrison at the head of Kyle's column, with the Highland wind coming hard from the west, and the snow packed solid under the horses' feet, and she did not look back. South, and into whatever came next. The Thorn Pass Narrows were a 3-mile corridor of highland rock where the terrain compressed everything, sound, movement, options, into a single channel that favored whoever arrived first and knew how to use the walls. Celine had studied the pass from Citadel maps 6 years ago when she was reviewing northern border vulnerability assessments, and she had flagged it then as the most significant defensive choke point in the entire Highland approach. She had written that assessment and submitted it to the council, and received a response indicating it would be reviewed in the next quarter's infrastructure session. She reached the Thorn Pass Narrows with 40 minutes to spare. Kyle deployed the garrison wolves into the high positions on both walls with the focused speed of a man who had been doing this longer than he'd been doing anything else, and who had stopped needing to think about the mechanics of it. She took the floor position herself, which he objected to for approximately 10 seconds before accepting, because she was the one who knew the Eastern Supply contract terrain and the local pack management structures and the specific pressure points that the Craven Advance Commander would be navigating, information that made her more useful on the ground than in the rear, and they both knew it. The Craven force arrived at the pass entrance 40 minutes after she did. 4,000 wolves, moving in the loose coordinated formation of a force that had been covering ground fast and expected to cover more. Their advanced scouts hit the Narrows first and stopped. She watched from the floor position as the scouts read the high walls and the garrison wolves positioned along them and the single figure standing on the floor of the pass, and she watched the scouts make the calculation that she had built the entire deployment around. This pass is held, the floor defender is deliberate. This is not an ambush, this is a negotiation position. The Craven Advance Commander came forward. His name was Aldrich, and she knew him from correspondence. A broad wolf of 50, with the weathered patience of someone who had been fighting on the Craven side of the border for 30 years and had outlasted 3 Velmoran administrations by being smarter than each of them about when to push and when to stop. He stopped his horse 20 feet from her, and looked at her with pale craven eyes, and said nothing for a long moment. "Luna Celine," he said finally. "I'm not Luna anymore," she said. "I'm the administrator of the Frostwall military territories, which currently includes this pass." He looked at her carefully. "I heard about the assembly. Then you understand that I'm not here on behalf of the throne. Why are you here?" "Because 4,000 wolves moving through Hollow Vale toward the capital is going to produce a response from Draven Viremont that will cost your clan significantly more than whatever you're being paid by the Eastern Noble Alliance." She watched him. "And because you're not stupid, Aldrich, you know the Eastern houses are using you as a pressure instrument. They don't care what happens to the Craven clans when Velmora responds. They care about the window your advance creates for their own moves." He was quiet. He had the quality of a man who was listening to an argument he had already considered and was waiting to see if the other person had thought it all the way through. "The Hollow Vale Passage is Craven territory under the border agreement," he said. "We're not in violation of any. You're in violation of the spirit of every agreement that's kept the border stable for 12 years, she said. "And we both know it. And we both know that the spirit of agreements is the only thing that actually keeps borders stable, because the letter of agreements is just a document, and documents don't stop armies." He looked at her for a long moment. The highland wind moved through the pass and lifted dust from the rock floor between them. "What are you offering?" he said. "A renegotiation of the Hollow Vale access terms," she said. "Independent of the throne, my authority, my signature, enforceable through the Frostwall Territorial Administration." She paused. "And the Eastern Noble Alliance loses its pressure instrument. You don't have authority to offer that." "I will have in 30 days, she said, "when the throne confirms the military territorial command restructure." She held his pale eyes with hers. "I am asking you to trust that this will happen, in exchange for turning 4,000 wolves around and going home." Aldrich looked at her. He looked at the garrison wolves on the high walls. He looked back at her. "If the terms aren't confirmed in 30 days, he said, "then you come back through Hollowvale and I won't be standing in your way," she said. "That's the deal." He looked at her for a long time. She stood in the Thornpass Narrows with the highland cold coming through her campaign jacket and her burned arm throbbing under the wrapping, and held his gaze without offering anything additional, because additional was weakness in this specific negotiation. And she had learned years ago that the most important part of making an offer was knowing when to stop talking after you made it. 30 days, he said. 30 days. He turned his horse and rode back to his force. She stood on the floor of the pass and watched 4,000 wolves reverse their formation and move back up the Hollow Vale track, and she breathed out slowly through her nose and felt the shake in her hands that had been waiting behind the tactical focus and let it move through her and pass. Cale was at her side within a minute. "That was," he said, and then didn't finish it. "I know," she said. "The 30-day confirmation is going to require Draven to move fast on the territorial restructure." "I know." "Which means you need to be in the capital before the end of the week." "I know, Kael." She turned and looked at him. He had blood on his jacket still from the assembly, she realized. The same jacket, dry dark at the left shoulder. "Are you ever going to tell me to stop doing dangerous things?" He looked at her directly. "No," he said. "Would it work?" "No." "Then it would just be noise." She almost smiled. The shake in her hands had fully passed. Her arm hurt, and she was exhausted in the specific way that came from running on operational focus for days without adequate sleep. And the Empire was still fractured, and the Eastern Noble Alliance still had resources, and the Craven situation was a 30-day delay and not a resolution, and she needed to be in the capital before the end of the week. She turned south. She rode into the capital 4 days later, arriving at the Citadel's gate in the late afternoon with Kael and the garrison column and road dust on all of them, and the particular atmosphere that followed a force returning from a successful field engagement. Not triumphant, because nothing that had happened was triumphant, but solid. The kind of solid that came from moving towards something difficult and not stopping. The court registered her arrival with the same careful recalibration it had been performing since the assembly, except the calculation now had additional variables. She had stopped a Craven advance through a pass negotiation that saved the throne a military engagement on an already fractured front, and she had done it independently, without Draven's authorization, from a territorial authority she didn't yet formally hold. The court was processing that. She could feel it processing as she rode through the Citadel's inner yard. Draven was waiting at the hall entrance. He was not in formal dress. He was in working clothes, the plain dark jacket he wore during council sessions and strategy reviews, and he looked like a man who had been working without stopping for 10 days and had not spent significant time in front of a mirror during that period. He looked, for the first time in months, entirely like himself, not the performance of a king managing his image, just Draven, which was both easier and harder to be in the same space with. He looked at her as she dismounted. His eyes went to her arm, the wrapped forearm visible below the jacket cuff, and then back to her face. Aldrich's force turned back, he said. Yes. The border monitoring confirmed it this morning. He paused. I didn't know you were at the Thorn Pass. I didn't have time to send word before I needed to be there. Something moved in his expression. She recognized it, the specific frustration of a man who understood completely why she'd done something without authorization, and was unable to argue with the outcome while still carrying the residual alarm of not having known where she was. Come inside, he said. The council needs to— Before the council, she said. I need to talk to you. He looked at her. Alone, she said. They went to the strategy room. The master maps were still on the walls. The Velmora Craven border map she'd been standing at 10 days ago with a sealed letter in her interior pocket, and the blood moon 3 days out, and she stood in the same room and looked at the same maps and felt how much had changed inside her relationship to the space. The room was the same. She was not. Draven stood near the window with his arms at his sides and waited. The Thorn Pass negotiation is a 30-day hold, she said. Aldrich will honor it if the Territorial Command restructure is confirmed. I need your formal authorization for independent military territorial authority over the Frostwall territories and the 6 northern pacts. My command structure, not subordinate to the Council, accountable to the throne for military outcomes only. You'll have it, he said. I was already drafting the authorization before you arrived. She looked at him. I know what you're capable of, he said quietly. I've always known. That was never the question. She held his gaze. There were a dozen things she could have said to that. She chose the one that mattered. Then why, she said, if you knew? Why did you spend 4 months performing as though you didn't? He looked at her and she watched him receive the question and not deflect from it, which was new. Not the sealed door, not the flat strategic attention. Just Draven, carrying the full weight of what he'd done and not trying to manage how that looked. Because I was afraid, he said. That's the complete answer. I dressed it in strategy and I made it logical, and I convinced myself the logic was the reason. But underneath the logic was fear of losing you to something I couldn't fight directly. He paused. And I fought it the worst possible way. I fought it by doing the damage myself so it would be controlled damage, so I'd know the shape of it. She stood in the strategy room and listened to Draven Viremont tell her the truth, finally, in plain language, without the architecture of strategy around it. That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 4 months, she said. Yes. It's also the thing that would have kept everything from breaking if you'd said it in month 1. Yes, he said again. The word had the weight of something a man carried when he understood precisely what his silence had cost and had stopped trying to reframe the accounting. She looked at the Craven border map. The Hollow Vale passage was marked with a small notation she'd added from the garrison dispatches. 30 days. She looked at the notation and thought about the ground between what was broken and what might be built on the cleared space, and she thought about what Kael had said years ago. Draven is not a stupid man, and about the specific difference between intelligence and wisdom and how a person could have all of one and spend years learning to develop the other. The bond is gone, she said. I know that. You know that. It's not coming back. I know. And I'm not— She stopped, found the actual words. I'm not the woman who stands beside the throne and calls it partnership when it isn't. That version of this is done. I know, he said. I'm not asking for that version. She looked at him. What are you asking for? He held her gaze for a long moment. When he spoke, it was with the voice he used when he had stripped everything else away and was operating from the bottom of himself, the place below strategy and performance, and the managed image of a king. I'm asking for the chance to earn something, he said, whatever that looks like, whatever form it takes. I'm not asking for what we had. I know that's gone. He paused. I'm asking for the chance to be someone you trust again. Eventually. In whatever time that takes. She stood in the cold strategy room and looked at this man she had loved for 9 years and watched ruin what they had from the inside out with his hands and his silence and his fear. And she felt the grief and the clarity and the absence in her chest where the warmth had been. And she thought about cleared ground and what held and what didn't. And she thought about the 30-day negotiation she'd made at the Thorn Pass on the strength of a promise she hadn't yet confirmed. She was very tired of making decisions alone in cold rooms. I'll be in the north, she said, building something that's mine. Independent command. My own authority. My own work. Yes. And when I come to the capital for council sessions or military coordination, and I will because the Empire requires it, that's what I'll be. A territorial commander, not a Luna, not a wife, not something managed. Yes, he said, that's what you'll be. She looked at him for a long moment. Then we'll see, she said, over time, what that looks like. It was not reconciliation. It was not forgiveness, which was not a thing she could produce on demand in a strategy room 10 days after the Blood Moon assembly. It was something smaller and more durable. A door left open a measured crack instead of sealed or shattered, with both of them standing on opposite sides of it, and neither of them pretending the distance wasn't real. He nodded once. She left the strategy room. Kyle was in the outer corridor, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and the patient quality of a man who has learned to wait for things that matter. He looked at her when she came out and read her face with the directness he'd always read it with, without performing an interpretation for her benefit. Done, she said. How did it go? Honestly, she paused. Maybe for the first time. He looked at her for a moment. And you? I'm standing up, she said. That's what I've got right now. He held her gaze. She held his. The corridor was quiet around them, the late afternoon light coming through the Citadel's narrow windows in long, cold lines, and there was something between them that had been building since the northern garrison, and before that, something she had been filing under careful taxonomies because the timing had never been right, and because she had needed to arrive at the end of one chapter before she could honestly consider the beginning of another. She was at the end of that chapter now. She didn't say anything, neither did he. But she held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary, and she watched him understand, in the way he understood things that she hadn't said out loud. And she watched something shift in his face. Not relief exactly, not urgency, but the settling of a man who had been holding something at a careful distance for a long time, and had just been given permission to stop holding it quite so far. Not now. Not here. But eventually. Eventually was something. She turned and walked down the corridor toward the administrative chamber where the Eastern dispatch files were waiting, and the Craven 30-day timeline was counting down, and the work of rebuilding a fractured empire from its broken places was not done and would not be done for a long time. She walked toward it the way she walked toward everything, without flinching, with her spine carrying the load, with the weight of what she'd been through settled into her frame, not as damage but as the specific ballast of someone who has survived the worst version of a thing and learned its actual shape. The grief was there. She wasn't pretending otherwise. The bond's absence lived in her chest like a permanent weather change. Not pain exactly, not anymore, but the persistent awareness of a difference between before and after that didn't require acknowledgement at every moment but never fully left. She had loved Draven Viremont since she was 20 years old in a war camp, and she would carry some form of that for the rest of her life, changed into whatever shape the years and the damage and the cleared ground made of it. But she was not only what she'd lost. That was the thing she had learned in the cold northern garrison, in the Thorn Pass Narrows, in the strategy room just now. You were not only the sum of what had broken, you were also the sum of what you'd built from the breaking. The decisions made under pressure, the negotiations held at gunpoint metaphorically and literally, the letters written and the supply routes confirmed and the bridge approved before the first snow. The Greyveil Bridge would be done by spring. She thought about that as she walked. Something that small and specific. A bridge she had pushed through a quarterly review committee with a favor she'd been saving for something larger that would let the Frostwall winter supply delivery arrive on time, that would take 4 hours off the local travel route, that would mean something to people who never knew her name and didn't need to. The Empire ran on 1,000 things like that. It had always run on 1,000 things like that, and she had been one of the people keeping them running, and she was going to keep being one of those people, except now from the north, from her own ground, on her own terms. That was enough. Not everything she'd wanted. Not the version of her life she'd been building when she was 22 and newly mated and still half surprised by her own story, but real and earned and hers. Kyl's footsteps came up behind her in the corridor. He fell into step beside her without comment, the way he had been falling into step beside her for years, in war camps and strategy rooms and garrison yards, and the cold passages of a citadel that had been her home and was becoming something else. She didn't tell him to go somewhere else. He didn't offer to. They walked together toward the administrative chamber and the work that was waiting. Outside the citadel walls, the last of the autumn light was leaving the highland sky in long ribbons of cold gold, and the first stars were coming in from the east. And somewhere in the Frostwall territories, the Greyveal bridge crew was working against the weather, and somewhere at the Craven border, the 30 days were counting, and the Empire of Velmora was battered and fractured and breathing, still standing, the way things stood when the people who built them refused to let them fall, even when everything else came apart. Celine walked through the citadel corridor with the work ahead of her, and the grief settled in her chest like permanent weather, and the north waiting for her return, and one small door left open in a strategy room behind her, and she thought, this is what survival actually looks like. Not triumphant, not restored, not the version the stories promised when you were young enough to believe they promised anything. Just this. One more step forward, then another. The door to the administrative chamber was ahead. She reached it. She put her hand on the iron handle. She opened it and went inside.